John, thank you so much for joining me today.
Pleasure to be here.
You spent decades studying Descartes. What do people most misunderstand about him today?
Well, Descartes has become a kind of hate figure in a way, I think, amongst contemporary philosophers, mainly because his views about the nature of the mind, that the mind or soul is an immaterial substance, are very much at odds with contemporary picture of ourselves as very much rooted in the biological and physical world. So his idea of the mind as a separate entity is out of favor. I think also his view of knowledge, that it can be built up from just one single or from a small foundational base. I think that is also less popular now. I think a more common view now is that we have a system of knowledge which we can adjust in different places, perhaps, if we need to, but there's no way we can build it up from a single self-evident base. So in those two ways, I think he's somewhat out of favor. On the other hand, his interest in the subjectivity of the mind, the idea of the mind as some kind of private arena, that I think rather surprisingly has revived a bit in the last 2 decades or so. So he's, I think, still an interestingly controversial figure, as indeed he was in his own day.
What do you think that led to that revival that you just mentioned?
Well, there's been a lot of interest recently on the topic of qualia, which was actually doesn't figure much in Descartes himself. I think Descartes was more interested in rationality and thought as properties of the mind. But there's been a lot of interest since a very famous article, which I'm sure some of your listeners will know, by Thomas Nagel, the American philosopher, called What Is It Like to Be a Bat?, where he talks about the subjective nature of sensational feeling. You know, what it's like for me to sip this glass of blackcurrant juice, or what it's like to smell a rose, or to taste coffee. And the view which a surprising number of philosophers of mind have taken up is that that qualitative nature of experience is not something that can be captured in any description of the structures going on in my brain or my body. And so that sort of turned the clock back in a way towards Descartes' scenario of the solitary mind, the solitary thinker. And we've now got a kind of dogma, really, that consciousness is something beyond the reach of science, which is, I think, something Descartes would have agreed with, though for rather different reasons.
Yeah. Is it fair to say in Descartes' theory that he articulates metaphysical claim rather than empirical? And how does that relate to the recent understanding that consciousness might be beyond reach of science?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. I think if you read his masterpiece, The Meditations, the impression is of pure metaphysics. Here is the thinker alone with his own thoughts, constructing a metaphysical system just from self-knowledge outwards. But actually, Descartes was what we'd now call a scientist. He was very interested in physiology. He was a great mathematician, and he pioneered the quantitative conception of physics alongside his contemporary Galileo. So there is a scientific side to all this alongside what you mentioned, the metaphysical side. And the scientific arguments, I think, occur in a number of places, but they hinge on something pretty empirical. Namely, he argues that when you look at the physiology, there simply aren't enough mechanisms to explain the great complexity of thought and language. In modern terms, you could say there aren't enough switches in the system to generate the creative complex output. For example, the conversation you and I are now having, which Descartes argues could never be reproduced by a mechanical system. But I think he says that because he has a pretty primitive view of physiology by our standards. Okay, so he thinks of the nerves as little gas pipes containing a subtle vapor or liquid, and just couldn't conceive of circuitry complicated enough to generate thought. If he'd known what we now know about the physiology of the brain, with its millions and millions of neural connections, that empirical part of his argument, I think, would have ceased to impress him, though he might still, for other reasons, have maintained the mind was an immaterial soul.
If we take a step back and look at the historical narrative, is it fair really to call Descartes the father of modern philosophy? In what ways?
Yes. Well, that label, he's probably stuck with it. I'd prefer to see him as a hinge figure, a transitional figure, because in some ways he is very modern. As I mentioned, his mathematical conception of physics, his idea that quantity, measurement, was the key to understanding the universe. That's a pretty modern conception. So he is at the very cusp of modernity in that sense. He's also, I think, been very influential in thinking that the question, what can I know, how much can I know, is in a way the first question in philosophy. So that I think also has been very influential for the development of modern philosophical thinking. On the other hand, in many ways, he harks back to the Middle Ages, to the great philosopher Thomas Aquinas, whose philosophy he was to some extent trained in. Certainly Aquinas' scholastic, as they're called, successors. And although he presented himself as turning the page, turning his back on scholasticism and medieval thought, he still puts God at the very center of his system. And you can't really understand the arguments and the meditations without seeing very clearly that central philosophical role that God has in his system and in the way he builds up his conception of knowledge from the private self via knowledge of God and then outwards to physics and science.
Yeah, I have always thought that stance that he has on these meditations, where he starts with the assumption that he's going to reject anything until there is a final certainty. And I think he also mentions somewhere that if he wanted to establish something that would last forever, he would first demolish everything. So I always had this connection with the father of modern philosophy, with that intention that he had in his mind.
Yes. If I want to achieve, I'm just quoting from memory, anything certain in the sciences, I realized it was necessary once in a lifetime to demolish everything and start right from the foundations if I wanted anything likely to last. That image of foundations has, I think, lost its influence to a large extent. the image that most of my philosophical colleagues come up with now is Neurath's boat, the German philosopher Otto Neurath, who said that it's as if we're in a boat at sea. We can't demolish it, otherwise we would sink. So what we maybe have to do is carefully remove one plank and replace it. But to do that, we've got to keep the others in place. So the idea of a clean sweep, I think, has gone out of favor. Another image Descartes has is of the town. He says towns are generally better when they're laid out afresh, new architects' plans. And some people who like Paris might agree. Those who prefer London might say, actually, that's wrong. It's more interesting if things grow up organically. You don't really want to take everything away and start afresh.
So that process of doubting everything, is that a permanent stance, or is this just a temporary intellectual tool that he's employing in the meditations?
I think the second is very much right. He wrote an introduction to the meditations called the Synopsis, which just lay out the arguments. At least I think it's the synopsis, or maybe it's a preface. Anyway, in one of the preliminary materials, he says, the purpose of my arguments is not that they prove what they establish, namely that there is an external world, there is a real world, because no sane person has ever doubted these things. So he's not a skeptic. He's not saying we should doubt. But as you said in your question, he's using it as an instrument, as a means, by putting pressure on things I've learnt as a child or from my teachers or at school, putting pressure on all those. It's helpful to see if any of them survive. And of course, as everyone knows, he singles out one proposition that he thinks does survive even the most radical doubts of the skeptic, namely, I exist, sum or exister.
Yeah, I think there is even interesting line there where it says, even if we, assume that there's a devil out there, there's an evil deceiver out there, let them deceive me as much as they can, but they cannot deceive me as long as I think I'm something.
Yes.
I always thought, so these days you also have these theories, like simulation theory. Some people argue for that we're inside a simulation. So it seems there is even some connection there to that idea that even if we are inside a simulation, one thing that's certain is that cannot be doubted, when I'm thinking about something.
Yes. Yes. I mean, I personally think some of these simulation scenarios are overdone, but I think Descartes has pointed to something quite powerful, that even if you're deceived in every imaginable way, you must still be there, in some sense of be there. You must still exist in order to be deceived. It's not a totally original insight. In fact, St. Augustine, who is quite a strong influence on Descartes, I think, many centuries earlier, said in Latin, si fallor sum, if I am deceived, then I exist. And although Descartes doesn't repeat that phrase, he was always rather prickly when people suggested he might have been influenced by previous thinkers, very proud of his new system. But he does say something pretty similar, as you say. Even imagine an all-powerful demon who is bent on deceiving and tricking him in every conceivable way. He can't make me nothing. Well, of course, he could. If an all-powerful demon could destroy me, could make me cease to exist, so he could do that. There's nothing necessary about my existence. but as long as I'm still thinking, just for that moment, I must exist. So it's a very temporary certainty. It's not there's any certainty about I exist. The certainty is I exist just so long as I am now focusing on the thought that I'm doubting or that I'm thinking or that I'm reflecting in some way. As long as that flicker of consciousness persists, there must be something or someone who is conscious.
If we take that conclusion and also link it to that famous phrase, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. If I'm not mistaken, I think in his writings, two different versions of this appear in discourses and also meditations. I think in the discourses, it is the original version, I think, therefore I am. But in the meditations, he says, I am, I exist. So what are some interesting differences in the way that is phrased, and what does this show about Descartes' philosophy?
Yes, thank you for raising that. That's an important point. Yes, in the discourse, the Discours de la Méthode, which was written in French and published anonymously, no name on the title page, in 1637, he uses this phrase, je pense donc je suis. I think, therefore I am, if you like. And in the Latin translation of the discourse that appeared a few years later, the purpose of a Latin translation was to reach a wider audience, as English is now. Latin in the 17th century was the kind of the international language among the learned to communicate. So in that Latin version of the discourse, we get cogito ergo sum. In his masterpiece, The Meditations, which was written in Latin and published in 1641, a few years after the discourse, he doesn't use that definitive phrase, cogito ergo sum. Instead, he says, as you rightly pointed out, sum existo, I am, I exist, is certain as long as it is put forward by me or conceived in the mind. In the Latin phrase is quoties profertur, as often as it's put forward, vel mente concipitur, or conceived in the mind. So when you add that later bit, you can see it is really the same thought. It's not the thought that I am is certain. It's the thought that I am is certain as long as I'm actually thinking it. That's why in the translation of the Meditations, which into English for the Cambridge edition of Descartes, which a team of three of us did, I was responsible for the Meditations, and I chose to render it not I think, therefore I am, but I am thinking, therefore I am. The idea there being, in English, we have two present tenses. We have I am walking and I walk, or I am thinking and I think. And the I am thinking is sometimes called the continuous present because it refers to an ongoing process. Okay. So that, I think, is probably a more helpful translation. It's not a sort of blackboard argument, premise I think, therefore conclusion I exist. It's more like an action, a performance. I am now thinking, and insofar as I'm now thinking, I can be sure that I'm existing.
As long as I'm thinking, I am existing. So that is like
Yes.
that condition. Yeah.
Exactly. As long as is the crucial phrase. Absolutely.
I think the Meditations, the full title of the book always interested me. Meditations on the First Philosophy, where the immortality of the soul and the existence of God is proven. So I think you also mentioned the God aspect there before. So how central is the idea of God to the Descartes philosophy? If we take the God out of the equation, would the philosophy have to be demolished, or can it still survive?
Yes, if you look at the very first title page,
Yeah.
the first edition, 1641, it says, in which the existence of God and the immortality of the soul are demonstrated, as you just quoted. But if you look at the second edition in 1642, the reference to the immortality of the soul is actually gone.
Oh,
He says, in which the existence of God and the distinction between the human soul and the body are demonstrated. I'll come to the question of God in just a second, but I think the reason he dropped that is pretty clear from some of the introductory remarks, that there's no actual proof of immortality. It could be, he says in those introductory remarks, that the soul just peters out, just comes to an end, unless it's conserved by God. But so there isn't a proof that it must, by its nature, last forever. So he doesn't follow Plato there in indirectly claiming to prove the immortality of the soul. But what he does prove, at least he thinks he proves, is that it's utterly different from the body, and therefore wouldn't necessarily be destroyed when the body decays and dies. Now, coming to God, I think in our very secular, I have no idea if you're a believer yourself, but in our very secular society, philosophy tends to bracket off this stuff as a kind of embarrassing extra, which isn't really philosophically interesting. So Descartes still studied in enormous detail, but the stuff about God tends to be receive less attention, as if, well, he's off his time, he was bound to mention God. But nowadays we just want to deal with, well, things like consciousness, things like skepticism, things like relation between the mind and the body. But for Descartes himself, I think it's absolutely central. And it's central in the way the meditations develop. Because if we just go from I think, therefore I am, I know my own existence, what's the next thing? Well, Descartes reasons, I'm immediately aware of my finitude, my limitedness. There are many things I don't know, many things I can't do. So I'm a limited, finite being who thinks, who is thinking. So I'm, if you like, a finite, limited thinking being. But in realizing my very limitations, I already see that I have a glimmer of something unlimited. The very notion of imperfection presupposes I have at least a grasp, or at least an inkling of something perfect and unlimited. And so very quickly I encounter the infinite. I think that's the story of the third meditation. Having proved he exists, he, the finite meditator, encounters the infinite. And that encounter with God is essential to everything that happens thereafter. So it's impossible to bracket that off, I think. If one does bracket it off, one misses what I think is a genuinely religious impulse. I don't know what you think about this, but I would say that sense of our human finitude is at the heart of the religious impulse, our longing to reach forward to something which we can't fully grasp, but something greater, something more perfect.
Yeah, when I was first like trying to understand Descartes' philosophy, I had this idea in my mind that maybe he is just trying to not offend people of his time of authority, so that he includes it there. But the more I read it, sometimes, yeah, it seems that he is genuinely trying to prove passionately. Because when you read the meditations, almost everywhere there is a question of God. It's everywhere. You find it everywhere. I think even in the
Mm.
start preface, he says something like, "We need to prove the existence of God using rational means because that's how we can convince atheists to become a believer."
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. And there's a key paragraph at the end of the third meditation where, for a moment, he drops the role of the critical philosopher and becomes the worshipper. Just again quoting from memory, he says, "Here let me pause for a while and gaze in wonder at the beauty of this immense light." And so it's quite a Platonic passage in a way, contemplating, it's sort of Christian Platonism, contemplating the immense light of the Godhead. And he goes on to say in that same paragraph that such contemplation is the source of some of the greatest joy we can have in this life. I, I agree with you. I think it's very difficult to read that sort of passage as just a cautious sop to the authorities. It does seem to me to represent an authentically religious strand in Descartes' thinking, quite apart from the role of God as a guarantor of science and knowledge.
Yeah, it seems like when you say, yeah, as long as I'm thinking I must exist, that indicates limitation on my part. And something, if there is something imperfect, there must be something also perfect. And that seems to lead to God in his understanding.
Mm. Yes. And that ability to reach towards the infinite, I think it shows, though Descartes doesn't put it in this way, it shows that our minds in a way are configured towards the truth and goodness and truth, so that once we can make that contact, even for a flickering second, then the light dawns, as it were. We can envisage the possibility of a system of knowledge. If we didn't have that ability, then I think we would indeed be lost in a pit of doubt and darkness. So there's a kind of basic premise about the reliability of the mind. Not everywhere, not in all things, because obviously we always make mistakes a lot of the time. So not always, but we make mistakes a lot of the time. We go astray. We choose the bad. We choose the false. But unless we had a belief that at least when our minds are at their clearest, e.g., when we're thinking of Descartes' example, a simple mathematical truth, 2 + 3 make 5, and just focusing on that we can't go wrong. And unless we were sure we were right about that, that our minds were structured to be able to perceive the truth in the simplest matters, then we couldn't be having this conversation. We couldn't be doing philosophy. We couldn't be meditating. The whole project would be impossible.
I hope you are finding this conversation interesting, and if so, please subscribe or follow on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts to get notified about the future episodes. Please also leave a like on YouTube or a review on Spotify. as this helps the show reach more people. Now back to the conversation. All right, so okay, then it seems that God equation is central to his philosophy in a way that he articulates. Do you personally find the arguments for the God's existence that he lays out convincing?
Well, fundamentally, there too, that in the fifth meditation, there's a version of the so-called ontological argument, though that's not Descartes' term for it, which is that a version of this was devised by St. Anselm of Canterbury many centuries earlier. And Anselm reasoned, well, I won't go, perhaps shouldn't go into Anselm this afternoon, but Descartes' version is very simple. It says that existence can no more be separated from the essence of, or nature of God than you can separate, say, from a triangle, some necessary property of the triangle, e.g. its angles equal 180 degrees. You can't, as it were, prise that off. It's built into the very concept of the triangle. Similarly, for Descartes, existence is built into the very idea of God. So we can't coherently assert the non-existence of God. This, in a way, harks back to Anselm, I mentioned, who quotes one of the Psalms from the Hebrew Bible: "The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God." The thought there being, it's stupid to try and deny God because you're trying to deny something that must, by its nature, exist. Now, that argument, there are people who still defend it, but I think the consensus among philosophers is that it doesn't really work. It's kind of tantalizing because there's something quite compelling in it in a way. But actually, Aquinas in the 13th century rejected it. He said, all it really shows is, I'm paraphrasing him here, but he said all it really shows is that if there is something which qualifies as the supremely perfect being, then it would have to exist. But we don't know that anything does qualify in the first place. So that's the ontological argument. The other one is the earlier one I referred to a few minutes ago in our conversation, which I think in a way is less of an argument than an encounter. It's the encounter of the finite mind with the infinite. Descartes produces a formal version of the argument. There must be, which hasn't, I think, I would personally say it's not very effective. It basically says there must be at least as much reality in the cause as in the effect. So the very fact that I have this idea of the perfect infinite being must have been caused by something, so it must have been put there by God. Well, that only works if you think there's no other way we can have got to this notion. So I think if it's expressed as a formal logical demonstration, it's perhaps not very convincing. But I think if we think of it as a journey, the journey of the finite mind or soul towards the infinite perfection of the Creator, it does have a certain power. It's not going to convince everyone, but I don't think there are any arguments for God which will either empirically or logically be watertight. You're not going to get that. What you are going to get is arguments which may resonate with people who are already inclined in a certain direction and may strengthen their belief.
Yeah, it seems like I would be interested to know what you think about this idea, is that the arguments for the God, it's more about rationalization than any empirical or any observation. So in a sense, if you believe that there is no way you can argue against it if you just follow the rationalization. Uh, so as opposed to empirical science, let's say. So this seems to be outside the realm of the empirical science if you follow those rationalization for the existence of the God.
Yes, I sort of partly agree with that. I mean, Descartes' arguments are not really based on empirical premises in the way, say, Thomas Aquinas's are. Thomas Aquinas starts from observation of things in the world. There are causal chains, therefore there must be a first cause. Or all his 5 proofs start from empirical premises in some way or other. For Descartes, no, it's a much more individual journey, starting not so much from empirical observation as from reflection on the ideas he finds inside him. I probably would question the word rationalization, though, because since Sigmund Freud, we've tended to think rationalization means people cobbling together reasons for thinking they might have wanted to believe anyway. And I don't think Descartes, no, I think he thinks there's genuine rational support for a source of truth, something which underpins the reliability of the human mind. So I think he would say there are reasons, genuine reasons, to believe in God, to believe that I'm not, as it were, self-creating, that I don't derive or construct, as some postmodernist philosophers would say, we just construct the truth for ourselves, or we construct our own values. We build our own values. This kind of post-Nietzschean fantasy. I think for Descartes, it's very important that we don't construct it all for ourselves. We respond to truth and to goodness. We respond to something other than ourselves, which is the source of truth and goodness. So I think he's not rationalizing there. I think there's something very fundamental in his view of the human mind as reflecting a truth which it didn't itself create. And that comes in the physics too, because he thinks that when we do mathematical physics, our mind is equipped to discern the fundamental mathematical principles which God, as it were, used in creating the world, the physical universe.
You mentioned Nietzsche there. I wasn't going to ask this, but it would be interesting to know what Nietzsche would have thought about Descartes. Do we know anything about that, like Nietzsche ever criticizing? Because he has this personality where he always goes back and criticizes old philosophers.
Yes, that's a very good question. And as far, oh Lord, I'm risking being refuted here, but as far as I know, not. But I'm not a Nietzsche scholar, so it could be that he does. In a way, there's something Cartesian about Nietzsche in the sense that he thinks he can overthrow previous systems and start with a new one. And that really reflects on, I think, this dual nature of Descartes. Descartes is both the innovator who thinks he's creating a new system of knowledge, but also in another way, a very devout follower of the tradition, insofar as he accepts the idea of objective truth and goodness, which I didn't create. So in that way, he's very non-modern, non-Nietzschean. But there's probably an interesting book to be written, perhaps it has been written, about the ways in which Nietzsche relates to Descartes. Yeah.
Yeah, I find at first glance it may seem that they may be very against each other, but I think maybe it might be the opposite, because if I remember it correctly, Nietzsche has this line where it says, one either must believe in God or create God. So this connection about the perfection, creation or discovery of perfection, I see some interesting, like like common idea there.
Yes, yes. And certainly in that place in Zarathustra, I think it is, where, the idea is that we've killed God. We've unchained the sun from its orbit. Everything is now chaos. I think in a way Descartes would agree with that, that once you abandon God, the whole foundation of truth and science and goodness is threatened. So yeah, I mean, one of the great things about philosophy is it's never just, like other sciences. There are always these interesting reachings forward, prefiguring of things that haven't yet been said, but also echoes of what has been said. And that's why I think the history of philosophy is vitally important. It's this is just a slight digression, but I think it's a shame that on the whole in the universities now, history of philosophy is less practiced, and students are expected just to deal with contemporary articles and things, which is fine. I mean, nothing wrong with modern articles, but I think without some knowledge of the great tradition, you're risking repeating the same mistakes, perhaps, at the very least.
Yeah, reading classics, great books is always rewarding intellectually.
Yeah.
You get the pleasure when you deeply understand something from the first hand.
Very much so, I think. Yeah, yeah.
There is aside from the I think therefore I am, another fascinating concept that he has is this mind and body distinction. I think it's less known in the popular culture than I think therefore I am. If you can just briefly explain simplified way, like what is this distinction really, and mind versus body?
Yes, I think Descartes' onto something quite important here. Matter, the subject matter of physics, is defined in Descartes in terms of extension. And by that he means quantity, whatever can be measured. I mean, he has a fairly simple conception of matter, just whatever can be expressed in 3 dimensions: height, breadth, depth, and motion. So all these are quantitative notions. And everything, he thinks, in the universe is reducible to mathematical laws of matter in motion. So for him, there's no real difference between biology and chemistry and physics. They're all just reducible to particles in motion. There's lots of interesting questions about that. But this whole system of a quantitative analysis, which is basically the system that science has worked with ever since Descartes, this, according to him, kind of grinds to a halt when we reach thought. Thought is not measurable in that way. And so he divides reality into 2 fundamentally different types of substance. Extended substance, what he calls in Latin res extensa, which is whatever can be measured and quantified, and thinking substance, res cogitans, thinking substance. So you and I are thinking substances. And in the discourse, which you mentioned earlier, discourse on the method, he declares that ce moi, this me, that is to say the soul, the soul by which I am what I am, is entirely distinct from the body and would not cease to exist even if the body was destroyed. So that's the fundamental division, what's often nowadays called Cartesian dualism, from from Cartesius, the Latin version of the name Descartes. So that's the dualism. However, well, perhaps I should just pause there, but I think that for me there are some problems about that which even in Descartes raise further interesting questions about how mind and body can be, although they're separate substances, can be united. In the sixth meditation, he talks about the soul or mind and the body being intermingled, closely intermingled, so as to form a unit. So, although in one sense I am a thinking thing, a pure, immaterial, non-physical soul, in another sense I'm a human being. And a human being is a creature with a body. So how can that be? How can I be both an immaterial soul and a human being? Well, because the soul is so intimately conjoined with the body. And his argument for that is really based on feelings, sensations. So if someone, say, bangs a hammer onto your hand, you don't just note it. This is Descartes, not the example of the hammer, but the example of pain. You don't just notice, my hand is damaged. Intellectually, you actually immediately feel it in that in that way that's very hard to describe, but we all know exactly what it's like if someone bangs a hammer onto your finger. It's an immediate, urgent sensation. And those urgent sensations or feelings are a sort of evidence that I'm not just a disembodied mind, but that I'm as we would now say, a biological creature of flesh and blood, a human being. There's a passage in a letter to a correspondent where he says, if an angel was in a body, it would just notice damage to the body, purely intellectually. Whereas if a human being doesn't notice it in that way. So sensations, feelings, passions, these are all evidence of in my view, these are sort of separate set of attributes. So this is what I call, I don't want to go on talking too much because I know too much information is sometimes
it's great. That's great.
A bit indigestible. But in my view, although there are only two substances, mind and body, there are actually three sets of attributes. There are attributes of pure mind, like intellect or volition, willing. There are attributes of the body, like digestion, respiration, all the properties a physiologist might study. But then when the two are together, there's a third set of attributes, namely feelings, sensations, passions. And these aren't really reducible either to properties of the mind or to properties of the body.
So those feelings, emotions, they also indicate in that theory that they point out to the thinking mind being a different substance that is independent of body.
Well, yes, but they also have a character of their own, I think. For example, supposing you now feel hungry, that's a very distinctive feeling. Descartes describes it in the Sixth Meditation as the I know not what tugging sensation. Hard to describe, but we all know what it feels like when you feel hungry.
Okay.
That's different actually from a thought, my body needs food, because you could have a pure intellectual thought, I now need to replenish my blood sugar. But that needn't be accompanied by any feeling or sensation. Similarly, your stomach could be contracting or your blood sugar could fall, but without any feeling. You might be asleep or anesthetized. So that again indicates, I think, that we have three sets of property: thoughts about the body, if you like, bodily states, but then feelings. And these feelings have the character of their own. An analogy I've often used about this is the example of water. Water, as we know, is hydrogen and oxygen, H2O. But water has its own special properties, watery properties, which are not properties of hydrogen, nor are they properties of oxygen. They just come into being when those two elements are combined. So these are new sets of attribute that arise when the two elements are intermingled. And that seems to be quite a good analogy for what Descartes wants to say about sensations and feelings. And it shows really that our human mental life is a bit more complex than that rigid dualism might suggest. It's more interesting in a way.
Yeah. Descartes was a great mathematician, scientist, philosopher with great contributions. What do we know about, this is the area that I haven't studied and explored. What do we know about whether he had contributions to moral philosophy, ethics?
Yes, he wrote a book called The Passions of the Soul, Les Passions de l'âme in French, which was published just the year before he died, 1649. And there he does talk quite a bit about ethics. And it very much focuses on what we've just been talking about a moment ago, these passions, these feelings that are signatures of our embodied nature. And ethics really consists for him of a way of training the passions. The thing about the passions, as we all know, is that they often lead you astray. People in the grip of the passions make terrible mistakes in their lives. And they later think, oh, if only I hadn't been swept away. So they can, Descartes puts it as follows: often the passions make things seem better than they really are. And only later, when you realize their true worth, come regret, remorse. This is very much the subject matter of ethics, the good life, how we can live better lives. And interestingly, he devises us, or he proposes a system which is quite scientific. Instead of just willing yourself, I will to do the good, which is maybe kind of often futile, he suggests a program of training where we can re-educate the passions so they fall in line with the good. He gives the example of animal training. A dog will naturally run away if someone fires a gun, but you can train a dog to freeze and gunfire and then go and fetch the bird or whatever it is if you shoot pheasants. So if you can train even an animal in this way, how much more, Descartes says, should we not be able to train our own bodily responses? So instead of leading us astray, they are, as it were, allies in the service of the good. So it's a scientifically enlightened conception of a route to an ethical or a good life.
So the correct use and correct training of passions and emotions. I think I also this is what I remember also from meditations that really
Mm.
resonated with me. It says there is perception and there is willing. Perception is limited, but willing is unlimited. And in a sense, when our perceptions are limited, and then we let our willing go unlimited, that's where we make mistakes in life. And
Yes, that you're exactly right about that. The argument in the fourth meditation, he's not talking about the passions there necessarily, but just about the fact the human will is infinite, but the intellect is very limited. And the recipe for avoiding intellectual error is that we should confine the will within the limits of what we clearly perceive. If we only assent to what we clearly perceive, then we can be sure we won't go wrong. If we jump in and assent, then to what we don't really clearly perceive, then that's the source of intellectual error. For moral error, I think we need a bit more. We need this program for the retraining of the passions, which he doesn't really discuss much in the meditations, but which, as I mentioned, is set out in the passions. So it's interesting there, Descartes' conception of philosophy is pretty broad. It includes, as we've been discussing this afternoon, not just metaphysics, but theology in a way, a search for God, physics and mathematics, and also ethics. And that's one of his appeals, I think, at least to me. We live in a very narrow, specialized academic world where people have their tiny areas of expertise. Whereas for Descartes, philosophy is this wonderful synoptic subject, which gives us an overview, really, a conceptual map of how things fit together, or in the case of mind and matter, don't necessarily fit together.
yeah, Descartes, I think, also lived a very adventurous life, traveling, military service, and then eventual death in the cold Sweden, in the Stockholm. How did this adventurous life shape his worldview?
Yeah, that's interesting.
Because he seems to be also intellectually sometimes all over the place in a good way, like exploring everything. But his life
Yes.
also seems to be that way.
Yeah. I mean, he, even when he was on his military travels in Germany, he the only episode we know about really is when he shut himself up in the stove heated room and engaged in what were later to become the meditations. So he's not a public figure. He's a very private figure, I think. The solitary meditator. And his motto, he writes somewhere, it's in an early notebook, was escape the notice, having lived, the Epicurean motto. Don't, as it were, don't make too much of a public appearance. Keep your life private. And he kept his own life pretty private. He left France in order to think and work in Holland, where he felt he'd be left alone, I think, more. Once he was in Holland, he very frequently changed his address, perhaps seeking solitude a lot of the time. And as you suggest, I think, in your question, by his one sort of public venture to go and be a tutor to the Queen of Sweden ended in disaster. He caught pneumonia and died when still in his 50s, a young age, certainly by today's standards. So he remains, I think, quite an enigmatic figure, a private figure who didn't really want to enter the public stage. He once described himself as the masked man, the man with a mask, keeping himself private. But as a result of his private meditations, we've been given one of the most fascinating philosophical systems. And I think, whatever you think of Descartes now, he has to rank as one of the perhaps half dozen greatest philosophical thinkers of all time.
I have one final question with two sub-questions. If Descartes was alive today, what kind of questions do you think he would be asking us? And the second question is that, as a great scholar of Descartes, what questions would you ask him?
Oh gosh, that's a tricky one. You've ended with the hardest question. I might, yes. I think he would probably be very interested in modern developments in physiology, particularly discoveries about the brain and the whatever it is, 8 billion neural connections in the brain. So I would like to ask him whether he would revise his view about the non-material nature of the mind in virtue of what we've now discovered about the brain. I think he'd be very interested with consciousness studies, but I think he would probably be pretty skeptical about the modern obsession with AI, which in my view, I'm a skeptic, I'm afraid, and I think it is not artificial intelligence, it's simulated intelligence, that these machines are able to trawl through vast amounts of data unimaginably quickly and then give a very good simulation of thought. And what he says, I think, in the discourse and elsewhere about the impossibility of genuine thought from a purely mechanical system, I think those questions show that his views are still very much, they've raised questions we still haven't properly sorted out today. So I think I'd probably ask him to talk about that. And maybe I'd also ask him about his views about God, and to say a bit more about the role of God in his personal life, because he's pretty cagey about that, though it's clear that the role of God is immensely important in his intellectual life, in his philosophical life. But one feature of the great philosophers is the dialogue always continues in a way, even though we can't, of course, literally speak to them. We will always construct our own image of the great philosophers for further dialogue.
That's a great line to finish. But in the remark about the AI, I think, given all the discussions that people are having about whether AI can become conscious or not, I can see Descartes being at the forefront, maybe arguing against that passionately.
I think you're absolutely right, and I would agree with him.
Thank you so much, John. It was a great conversation. It was great to have this discussion with you. I learned a lot also from your point of view about the Descartes as well. So thank you so much.
Right. Well, thank you, Masood. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and thank you for your really interesting questions.
Thank you for listening or watching. If you want to stay updated on future episodes, you can follow the show on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. Please also consider leaving a like on YouTube or a review on Spotify, as this helps the show reach a lot of people. You can also leave comments if you have any personal thoughts on the topics discussed during the episode. More conversations and solo episodes are on the way in the following weeks. and following the show is the best way to be notified about them. If you would like to reach out to me directly, you can DM me on Instagram at philosophy.everyday. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.